You guys know because you live here, but like it was astonishing. It was this rich, vibrant world that I could not believe. And the thought that went through my head has stuck with me my whole life since that moment. It was, how do I live on the same planet as all of this? And I never knew it was here before.
Aloha, everybody. Aloha. It's a good crowd. I'm Michael Bruno. I'm provost here at UH Manoa. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here and in part host this very special event and special talk. I do have the obligatory services to render here at the start on behalf of Robert and the team, and I will start that way because we always end that way. I really need to thank Robert Perkinson and his crack team, who you've seen all around this evening. You guys do an amazing job. You make us proud here at the university with the events that you run. So thank you. So it's always dangerous to start introducing all the VIPs because every other one of you is a VIP, I swear. So I'm just going to say we have people from the legislature, from the city council. We have the State Climate Commission. We have DLNR represented here. We even have the Supreme Court represented here in the front row. With the difficult questions, Julie, front row. That's where it happens. We have folks from NOAA, from the EPA, from Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, East-West Center, Kuleana Coral, Kamehameha Schools, the Hawaii Community Foundation, and many more. So mahalo to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. I want to thank the sponsors. In particular, I want to thank the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. Roger, thank you. You've been a great partner to the university. And of course, the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series. The series is a joint venture of UH Manoa, the Hawaii Community Foundation, and Kamehameha Schools. So thank each of those organizations. I guess I'm thanking myself there, but that's silly. We have outside support from the State Climate Commission and the Halekulani Hotel, and inside support from CTAR, SOEST, the College of Social Sciences, and a whole lot of other support people from across the campus. So thank all of you. And on with the main event. So I've written up a few things here. In the next 30 minutes, what I'd like to discuss, no, I'm kidding. So I'm here to introduce Juli Berwald. I hope you have had the chance to meet her informally outside. We had a nice chance to get to know one another just earlier. Juli is the author of Spineless, The Essence of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone. I love the title, and you're going to see, I'm sure, in the talk that Juli weaves personal experience into her stories, the stories of science and nature. But the reason we're here this evening is the other book, the new book, Life on the Rocks, Building a Future for Coral Reefs. So a bit about Juli. She was, well, you live now in Austin, Texas, but you were raised in St. Louis, Missouri. These are both landlocked places, so this is fascinating that you do what you do. Julie has a bachelor's degree in math from Amherst and a PhD in ocean sciences from USC. And I just learned today that that experience produced all these connections to folks working here at UH Manoa. It's wonderful to hear all of that. And at USC, Julie studied satellite-based observations, looked at the development of tools to use satellite observations to better understand the ocean, in particular the role of phytoplankton, which through photosynthesis, a lot of you know this, are able to uptake carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and also produce oxygen. These are important engines for our planet. I wanted to look at something maybe other than a simplistic CV, and I read a bunch of things about Julie in advance, and one thing I was struck by was a story that you recounted in an interview with the Amherst Alumni Association that I was really fascinated by, and there might be a lot of scientists in the room that will kind of relate to this. While at Amherst, and I think this was following a study abroad experience in Israel, where you had your first opportunity to snorkel at that time in the Red Sea, and you were captured. And when you came back, you decided you wanted to study the biomechanics of marine organisms. Do you remember this interview? Yeah. And somehow, Julie discovered that there was an unused flow tank in a building, I think a geology building on the Amherst campus, which lay below a floor because that building, the geology building, used to be a gym, and it had a retractable floor, which when it retracted, unveiled a swimming pool. And I immediately thought, reading this story, is that where they filmed that scene in It's a Wonderful Life where they're dancing and the floor opens up? We'll have to look into that. Anyway, there was a flow tank underneath the floor in a pool. It was empty. The pool was empty, but the flow tank was there sitting in the pool. And Julie made use of this hidden piece of instrumentation, and I think you said the experiment was sort of ill-conceived, but it was the first time I really felt like I was doing science. And I thought that was significant. And then, of course, you went on to USC and academia, from there to a textbook writer and articles for National Geographic magazine, the New York Times, Nature, and many others. About life on the rocks, another reviewer wrote, she is reminded of her daughter through much of her research on reefs, making for moving dual storylines about health, healing, and hope. Julie.
So I'm really just incredibly grateful to be here. I'm actually a little blown away that you invited a landlocked Texan to talk to you about coral here in Hawaii. But I do want to say thank you so much to Roger and Robert and Michael and everyone else who's made this possible. Being a part of the speakers series is just an absolute privilege. And thank you for coming to listen to me tonight. Because I sort of feel like I almost have no real business being here, I thought I might start with my journey, which actually Michael has sort of already mentioned. I grew up very landlocked in St. Louis, Missouri, and I had never stuck my head underneath the water for my whole life until I went to college, and then my junior year, as Michael mentioned, I went to Israel, and I was pretty miserable on this study abroad program. I was not fitting in with the other people in the program. I was having trouble making friends. I was eating too much falafel, and it was just problematic. And I walked past a building, and there was this sign on the side of the wall, and it said, Marine Ecology course, 1 week in a lot in the Red Sea, sign up here. So I ripped off the tab and called the number, and the next thing I knew, I was getting off a bus, and there were these crazy, beautiful red mountains and this incredibly blue sea, and someone threw a mask and snorkel at me and some fins, and they're like, walk backwards, get in the water. And so I did. And I stuck my head down, and you guys know because you live here, but it was astonishing. It was this rich, vibrant world that I could not believe. And the thought that went through my head has stuck with me my whole life since that moment. It was, how do I live on the same planet as all of this, and I never knew it was here before? And I was blown away by the beauty and the energy and the vibrancy and all this kind of these animals that were so foreign to me. And I got out of the water, and then there was this professor there who was like, 20 species of coral, memorize them, we're having a test tomorrow morning. And I was like, ah! But I memorized these Latin names, and even those names felt like these incantations of something just incredibly brilliant and beautiful. And I decided I'm going to be a marine biologist in that moment. And, life doesn't always go in a straight line. So I applied to every marine biology lab that was studying coral at the time, and there weren't as many as there are now. And I didn't get accepted by any of them because maybe I wasn't the best candidate, having only taken one biology class before. But I did get in. I was a math undergraduate, which I don't always talk about, but I was. And so I did get into graduate school to study something else that was also colorful and beautiful, which was these satellite images of the ocean. And at the time, we really didn't understand this. These were some of the first images of the ocean that were coming back to us from satellites. This is called the SeaWift satellite. And before this, the only way we'd had of looking at the ocean was by going out in a ship track, and taking samples and looking at photosynthesis that way. But now we had this incredible map of photosynthesis, and it was so much more complicated than we had understood before. And so the question was, how much carbon dioxide is the ocean taking up? Because we knew already, this is in the 90s, that we were pumping a ton of carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere. But how much were these little teeny single cells able to take up by taking carbon dioxide and water and the power of the sun and creating sugar, and in that way sucking up carbon dioxide? And so I played this teeny little role in the answer, but the answer came, and it's about 30%. So 30% of the carbon dioxide that we've emitted from burning fossil fuels has been taken up by the phytoplankton in the ocean. And if they weren't out there doing that for us every day, we would be in a lot worse shape than we're in right now. Unfortunately, I sort of fell off the academic path after I finished my PhD. And or maybe not, unfortunately, but I did fall off the path. And I ended up writing first textbooks and then eventually mainstream science articles. And I got this kind of great gig working for National Geographic for a while. And I was asked to work on this article called The Acid Sea as a fact checker. And ocean acidification is this kind of other evil twin of the carbon dioxide issue in the atmosphere, because when carbon dioxide mixes with water, it decreases the pH of the ocean, and that's kind of pushing it more toward the acidic side. And that can make it harder for animals with shells to make their shells. And so I was supposed to fact check this winners and losers, who thrives and who struggles in a more acidic ocean. And somehow that jellyfish on the bottom corner jumped out at me. And I was like, what do we know about jellyfish and ocean acidification? And it turned out we hardly knew anything. There was not very much science actually done on it, but there was this huge debate going on in the scientific literature about whether jellyfish numbers were increasing, were they decreasing, what was happening. And it was so fascinating to me that I ended up writing this book called Spineless: The Science of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone. And this book has a lot of jellyfish science in it, but it also was the story of me growing from being a scientist to becoming a science writer, and recognizing that my voice had a place in this world, that especially as our oceans are facing more and more challenges. And the book really found an audience, and it was so exciting to me that people wanted to read about jellyfish, but also that they really connected with the personal story. And I knew that I had the opportunity to write a second book. And so I started thinking about the coral again, because they were my first true love. And as you guys know, coral live in all the tropical, those dots all represent coral reefs. So the coral live in all the tropical parts of the ocean. And they support some of the richest ecosystems. 1/4 of all marine species rely on coral reefs at some point in their life. Coral reefs are responsible they're the best defense against storms coming towards land. 97% of the energy from a storm can be diffused by a healthy coral reef. Because they support so many species, they support also people. It's up to 1 billion people rely on coral reefs for their primary source of protein. And because of all of the things they do, the coastal defense, the source of protein, and tourism, they are responsible for estimates of around $2.7 trillion in economic value every year. So coral reefs have outsized influence on our oceans. But what's really weird about coral reefs is that these parts of the oceans, the tropical parts of the oceans, because of the oceanography of our planet, they're really nutrient poor. They're kind of like the deserts of the oceans. And yet this incredibly rich ecosystem exists here. And so why is that? Because coral are polyps. They are colonies of many, many polyps, and these polyps are super small. But it's really important to remember that coral, even though they kind of look flowery and floral, they are animals. And they eat, and they have tentacles and mouths, just like jellyfish, but kind of upside down. But when you look deeper into the polyp, what you discover is kind of their superpower. So that on the bottom is the coral polyp, and then inside the coral polyp are these beautiful kind of amber-colored cells, and these are algae. These are the same phytoplankton I was studying as a graduate student, but they've made a really interesting decision, which is they've decided to live inside of the coral's tissue like a tattoo. But when they're in there, they do the same thing the coral do out in the ocean, which is photosynthesize. And these beautiful little algae give 90% of the sugar they make through photosynthesis to the coral. And that is crazy fuel that the coral can use to build their limestone skeletons. And that becomes the great architecture of our planet's reefs. And so this is a coral from Hawaii, but, and wait, hang on a second. I want to make sure I get this right. And here the story kind of shifts to Hawaii. Because in the 1950s, there was sort of a surge in a demand for electricity here. And that caused a need for expansion in the electrical supply here. So about 18 miles away on the west side of the island, the Hawaiian Electric Company built a power plant. And they did what a lot of power plants do, which is to cool the turbines using seawater. And so the seawater comes in, it gets heated up because it cools the turbines, and then it gets put back into the ocean, and it's much hotter then. And in the 1970s, the Clean Water Act was passed, and that, for the first time, required that the power station develop a monitoring program to see what that heated water did to the surrounding sea life. And that was around the time that two young scientists from the mainland showed up here. One was named Paul Joe Keel, and he was from Illinois, and the other was Steve Coles, and he was from Georgia. And they were given this project to see what was happening at that outfall, which is now called Electric Beach. And what they saw, maybe not surprisingly, was really close to the hot water, the corals were killed. But just a little bit away, where the temperature of the water was maybe a degree or two higher, the coral weren't dead, they were just white. And that Paul and Steve called bleaching. And that was the first time the word was used in the scientific literature that I can find. And so the word bleaching was actually coined here in Hawaii. And over time, Paul and Steve discovered that this bleaching didn't just happen near outfalls from power stations, but it could happen at low tides, it could happen when heat waves came in and brought warmer water. It happened all over the place. And so what was this bleaching? So I've told you about a healthy coral, which has these algae that live in their tissues and are very happy. But when the temperature increases, the coral becomes stressed. And we don't know. It's kind of an amazing thing that we still don't know who starts this problem. It could be that when the temperature rises, the coral starts to feel stressed, and its immune system says, I'm not happy. I need to ramp up all of my alerts. Anything that's not coral is going to get kicked out, and they kick out the algae. Or it could be that the algae are like, hang on, my host, which used to be a really good place to live, is now feeling stressed. I don't need to be here for this. I'm going to reveal myself to the coral's immune system and get kicked out, because I'm fine swimming around out there in the ocean. So we don't know which of those two things has happened, but regardless, if the temperature rises by like a degree or two for a couple weeks, the coral and the algae symbiosis falls apart. And then you have what's called a bleached coral. And it's bleached because the algae has taken its color away. It's also taken that incredible source of fuel, all that sugar, that photosynthetic sugar. It usually feeds the coral, takes that away too. And so the coral is suddenly starving. And if the temperature doesn't fall and the symbiosis doesn't get reestablished, the coral will die. And we already think that about half the coral reefs have died from bleaching, and the prognosis is really bad. For 2050, if we don't deal with climate change, only 1% of the coral are expected to be alive. And so what we can see here, this is kind of a graph. This is the only graph, I promise. So on the bottom, we have 1975 up to the present. That black line shows the temperature of the ocean, and you can see it's been quite kind of, up and downs, but it's been basically rising. And what you can see is like when Paul and Steve did their work in the 70s, the temperature was quite a bit lower. And so this whole idea of bleaching was sort of a niche thing. Like it was just sort of something they noticed near the outfall. But then in the 80s, that red line shows there was a huge blip in upwards spike in temperature, and what happened was there was a regional scale bleachings. These are things we call mass bleachings. And then we had another one in the late 90s, and then from 2010 basically till now, mass bleaching has become something that's chronic as the temperature has continued to increase. So knowing all of this predictions about coral and bleaching and what was happening out there, even though I really wanted to write my second book about coral, I was pretty nervous about doing it because I did not want to write an obituary. But I did what you do when you are flirting with an old romance again. I stalked it online, and this meeting. Oh, sorry. This is what a bleached reef looks like. But when I stalked the coral online, I found this meeting called Reef Futures 2018, and Reef Futures had a very positive sound to it because it was like, oh, reefs will have a future. And then when I looked at the agenda for the meeting, I found that this wasn't a meeting about the doom and the gloom side. This was a meeting about what is happening out there to protect the coral. What are people doing? Where are the innovations? And I was like, you know what? This is a story that I think I can write. And so I decided to follow around some of the people who I thought were doing some of the most interesting stuff from this meeting. And that's what I did. And one of them was, unexpectedly, the Mars Candy Bar Company. And they were doing this project in Sulawesi, Indonesia, where they had a chocolate factory. And what they had discovered was that as the reefs started to fail there, the people who worked in the factory were suffering because they used the reefs for their food and also for extra income. So Sulawesi is located, there's a map up at the top there, Indonesia and the Philippines and Papua New Guinea kind of make a triangle, and that's called the Coral Triangle, and that's really the center of coral diversity in the world. And so Sulawesi is right in the middle of it. And what it looks like are these sort of very low-lying islands that are very densely populated. They don't have any water or sewage treatment. Everything that comes in to the island has to come in by ferry, and everything that comes off has to come off by ferry or go into the ocean. But you can see that they're surrounded by these really, really beautiful coral reefs. The problem is that there's a lot of poverty and also corruption in the government there, and so blast fishing is rather common. And this is a place that has been blast fished, so what this means is homemade bombs are thrown onto the reef to stun the fish, which makes it easy to collect them. But when you blast fish, the coral is destroyed, and this is a 30-year-old blast fish site, so the coral just can't come back. And so what the Mars people did was develop these reef stars, they call them, which are something that the local boat makers build. They're made out of rebar, they're covered in a boat resin, and then local sand is put on top of them. And then they take fragments of coral that they find on the reef, and they attach them onto these reef stars, and they have the local fishermen, they pay them to do it. And then they network them together in these sort of galaxies of reef stars. And then 18 months later, the coral grows over them, and you can see that just the star part of the reef star is left visible. And then 3 years later, you don't see any rebar at all. And when I was on this reef, I saw sea turtles and sharks. And so it's supporting the kind of ecosystem, the complex ecosystem that we hope that coral reefs can support. So that was they've done about 10 hectares of reef, which is about a hectare's, so it was about 20, a hectare's about 2.2 acres, I think. So about 20 acres of reef have been restored in Sulawesi. And it's really a story of hope. That this can happen. In the Dominican Republic, they're going at a different side of the coral restoration story, which is sexual reproduction. Coral can, so in Sulawesi, those fragments, they're clones of coral that already exist on the reef because they just are fragments that you are growing up new. But if you want to get more genetic diversity, you need the coral to spawn and reproduce. And so in the Dominican Republic, I went to visit for the coral spawning, which is just this incredible event that happens, a few days after the full moon in August, a certain number of hours after sunset, and you go down there and you watch, and then all of a sudden, the reef comes alive. It's like buffet time. All these invertebrates that you never ever get to see are there chomping away at all these eggs that are coming out of the coral. But what happens is the eggs and the sperm float upwards, and they hopefully meet each other and produce these little larvae. Oh, and I'm not sure it's showing up so well, but in that top left picture, little larvae, coral larvae, look like a little frilly Tic Tac. They're like, or a grain of rice with little cilia on it. They're teeny, teeny, teeny. And so what they're doing is doing kind of like these massive egg and sperm mixed together, let's make some larvae, and then creating lots of different substrates to see what the larvae want to settle on, where they want to live. And then on the bottom, which side is that? Right. They are incubating them in these kind of floating giant kindergartens and letting the little larvae settle on these substrates and grow a little baby skeleton, get their algae established, feeding them a bunch of sugar, and get big enough so that they aren't nipped away by all the predators on the reef, and then they can take these little tinker toy things and throw them back in the water and plant thousands of coral this way and increase the genetic diversity that's out there on the reef. The other place I really wanted to go was Australia. The Great Barrier Reef. So here we're looking at Australia. This is the northeast corner of Australia, and the Great Barrier Reef stretches along that northeastern corner of huge swath. It's not a corner. It's a huge swath of Australia. The Great Barrier Reef it's about 3,000 smaller reefs, but in total it's like the size of Italy. So it's giant. And prior to 2016, the Great Barrier Reef really had not experienced mass bleaching. But then in 2016, which I think was also a bad bleaching event here, the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef bleached pretty severely. And then in 2017, and this is all, 2016 and 2017 are all called the third global bleaching event, because they kind of, this heat wave like circled the world twice, and it caused mass bleaching throughout the world. So it hit the Great Barrier Reef twice in 2016 and 2017. And so the Australian government decided, like, we really need to do something about this. And they created this huge program to look at all the different things they could do to combat, to protect their reef. And so at the beginning of 2020, I got an invitation to visit the Great Barrier Reef and take part in a research cruise that was going to happen there, which is really something quite audacious. They were going to use sea spray to brighten the clouds over the reef. And the idea is that by adding salt crystals to marine clouds, you will reflect solar energy away from Earth. And underneath that brighter cloud, you can get local cooling on the order of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of change you need to protect coral from bleaching. So I was supposed to leave for this really exciting demonstration research cruise in March of 2020. But yeah, no spoilers, that did not happen. But before I knew it wasn't going to happen, I was so excited for the opportunity, but I was also extremely nervous, because alongside all I was learning about the coral, I was also struggling to learn what was happening to my once happy and very engaged 14-year-old daughter. So when I had gone to that original Reef Futures meeting 2 years earlier, I actually left the meeting on the phone discussing whether my daughter could continue in school. And by the time I was supposed to be going to Australia, what turned out to be a very severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder had metastasized so much that my daughter could barely leave our house. In February of 2020, my husband and I got word that our daughter could have a bed in a residential treatment facility in Wisconsin. And her admission date was 2 days before I was supposed to go to Australia. Given that there are only 36 beds for severe OCD adolescents in the United States, and as unknowns about how COVID was being transmitted were proliferating around the rumor mill, my husband and I decided that we would drive from our home in Austin, Texas to Wisconsin, about 1,000 miles, to make sure that our daughter could get the treatment that she needed. It turns out that we weren't the only ones making a 1,000-mile drive. In Australia, the cloud brightening team was also making a 1,000-mile drive from Southern Cross University near Sydney up to Townsville. And the entire research team had bubbled up against COVID. They were able to get out to sea, and their experiment with cloud brightening was even more successful than they had expected. And ours was as well. Our daughter spent about 100 days in Wisconsin, and the tools that she learned there saved her life. And then in the quiet of COVID, as I pondered the corals and what was happening with my daughter, what seemed disparate stories became intertwined. I've already told you just how foundational coral reefs are to our planet. And likewise, without mental health, everything else that sits on top of it, academics, friendships, a future, falls apart. And similarly, these two things are too often invisible. As terrestrial beings, many of us who don't have the privilege of living so close to the sea forget about its life. And it's very easy to look at a person and not seeing the suffering beneath the surface. I didn't plan to write these stories together, but when I sent the draft to my editor, she said it was some of the most powerful writing I had ever done. And so with my daughter's approval, it all ended up in this book, Life on the Rocks, Building a Future for Coral Reefs. And if I can take a second, I'd like to acknowledge my daughter for being here with me today, for her generosity and courage to let me share her story, and for her strength to fight the battle that she's fought. Because it's really my daughter who taught me the most important connection between the coral reefs and mental health. As much as we might want one, there is no silver bullet for either of these problems. We do have tools to fight them, but they require hard work, continuous funding, and constant vigilance. I'm often asked what we can do to help the coral. The answer is ultimately one of climate change. We need to support systemic change to bring the carbon emissions down. Here in Hawaii, you have more opportunities. You can help support efforts to stop runoff, to restore coral, and to deal with sanitation. Regardless, it's really important that we always let our elected officials know that we care. As I traveled to see the coral around the world, I didn't only see sick coral. I saw many healthy reefs that are still out there, still vibrant, and still supporting marine communities. And I also learned that 5 years ago, Steve Coles, who still is working here in Hawaii, repeated the same experiments on bleaching corals at the hot water outfall at Electric Beach that he did in 1970. Back then, all of the coral that were exposed to 88 degrees Fahrenheit or 31 degrees Celsius, they all bleached. In 2017, corals exposed to the same conditions, none of them bleached. I think that by looking very carefully at the coral, we can be inspired to do better. I think in that their stories of adaptation, resilience, and restoration, the corals show us what it's possible to accomplish when we care. Thank you so much.
My name is Michael Park. I work for NOAA. Given the level of production that would have to take place to do the type of transplanting that you're talking about in the few examples that you gave, how are we going to get to that type of level of reintroduction? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that is exactly like the crux of the problem. So like where the coral restoration world is right now is there have been a lot of ideas, and the ground truthing has been poor. And so that's where they need to be right now is putting things in the water, trying things out, and seeing like what actually works. But in the meantime, the field has also attracted a ton of attention. And I think you may know, I don't know, but there's like a new project since the book came out in Saudi Arabia where they're trying to increase the restoration by an order of magnitude to be 100 hectares. And that's massive. It's going to cost over $1 billion. And so you're right. Scaling up is extraordinarily, like that's the stumbling block. And there's no way to restore ourselves out of this problem. I think the idea is to protect critical reefs in critical places so they can become, hopefully, so that they can be healthy so that when we eventually do get climate change under control, they can then repopulate the rest of the reef. So it's kind of an island idea. But no, you're right. The scaling up is still a huge stumbling block. Yeah.
Let me ask a question of Manuel, who's working on a protection project in Maui, and if you might tell us a little about what you all are doing.
Thank you, Julie, for that beautiful talk. I'm with the Coral Reef Alliance, and we're trying to address local stressors such as land-based pollution, sedimentation from fallow industrial ag lands, but also sewage, which is a huge problem. There's 88,000 cesspools in Hawaii. And so I think by addressing those stressors first at the local scale, then we can have a better chance of success and livelihood for restoration and replanting corals out there. So it takes a whole village, like you said, and every little bit helps. Well,
Yeah.
There's some hands over here, Ree.
Hi,
Hi.
Sabrina McKenna, and I'm not a scientist. Why is it that in 2017, coral were not bleaching at 88 degrees Fahrenheit or 31 degrees centigrade?
So it's hard to say what exactly happened because the genetics were not done in the 1970s to know if they're the same colonies now or not. They didn't have the genetic capabilities then. So we don't know whether the coral have adapted or it's a new, these are new individuals. So whether the colonies themselves have somehow adapted or whether these are just new individuals that are able to handle the higher temperatures. But it's not, it's anecdotally, I've heard it in several places around the world, at Orpheus Island and the Great Barrier Reef, where a lot of science gets done. They've noticed the same thing. The coral there are not bleaching at the same temperatures they used to bleach at. They're able to tolerate higher temperatures. There's a really interesting story going on, which is that the strain of algae that has for, say, the last, I don't know, million years associated with coral are called cladocopium. When the coral bleach, some coral, when they bleach and then establish a new symbiosis, that new algae that they're teaming up with is called Duristinium. It's a different strain. And the Duristinium can handle a higher temperature than the cladocopium, about 1.5 degrees higher. But the Duristinium are more selfish. So they're only giving the coral about 65% of the sugar that the cladocopium used to give. So it's almost like, okay, my air conditioning's out in the building. I'll be a tenant in your building, but I'm gonna pay you less rent. And the coral may be making the deal because they're like, I'd rather have a tenant than no tenant. So like, it's an interesting thing. They're seeing it, this Duristinium is global. It's invasive to the Caribbean, but it's there now. And they're seeing this kind of switch happening all over the world. And so we don't know if the switch happened. I don't think anyone's done that work yet. They have seen the switch here in Hawaii, I think. Maybe some people can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But they've definitely seen it in the Caribbean. They've seen it in Orpheus. And so it's an interesting story unfolding.
I wanted to call on a couple of people from UH, because UH does a huge amount of research in the area of coral reefs, from, genetics of coral polyps and algae to engineering for coral restoration. And I wanted to maybe ask Eleanor Sterling, who's heads our largest marine biology program at UH, to tell us about one or two of the initiatives that are especially interesting.
And thanks for such a great talk. In fact, a lot of the things that you spoke about, some of those other places in the world, are happening here in Hawaii and the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. And another thing that I think is really exciting and potentially starts to get at the question of scale is the whole bay of Kaneohe. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it was completely covered with things coming from on land. It used to, actually, even before that, there were glass-bottom boats that would go around the south part of the bay. You can't even imagine that the people were looking at beautiful corals right in front of where HIMB is now. And then the nearshore areas basically inundated those with sediment and other things, sewage in particular. And yet, once that stopped in the 70s, the bay started to recover. And so in some ways, that whole entire bay is a beacon for us of hope and understanding what the future could look like as organisms adapt, as we figure out what to do. As Manuel said, we really need to pay close attention to what we're doing on land. And we make connections with coral health. A lot of the work at HIMB is showing that you can find fentanyl in the corals, you can find antidepressants in the corals. So a lot of the decisions that we make about our human health are actually impacting the health of corals. But so remembering that connection and understanding that connection is something we're doing a lot at HIMB. And also thinking about indigenous marine management systems from the past are helping us with these hybrid reefs, with these 3D modeling that you're talking about. But really learning from what happened here in Hawaii in the past is something that we're spending a lot of time working on with our colleagues, our local collaborators.
Thank you.
Oh, are you holding it for me? Wow.
One lesson we learned from Speaker Series is never lose control over the mic. Even though you look like a very person.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Laura. I work with Malama Mauna Lua, which is an environmental nonprofit that focuses on restoring Mauna Lua Bay. And we are partnering on a project to restore our reefs in Mauna Lua Bay with the Coral Resilience Lab, formerly known as the Gates Lab, and Kuleana Coral Restoration, and NOAA and DAR. And so I think this is so awesome that you wrote a book about the same topic, because we're working to restore our reefs with thermally resilient corals. But I wanted to ask more about the the cloud brightening science and like the technology. What does that process look like, and how does it work?
Yeah, so the cloud brightening idea, well, I kind of just plopped the boats up there, but basically it's just a big, almost like a snow-making machine, and it has these specialized nozzles on it that turn the seawater into micron-size droplets, and they're light enough that they float up to the clouds, and then those small particles coalesce water droplets around them and make the clouds brighter. And so it's not complicated. I mean, it's a little complicated, but it's not like, it's a knowable kind of thing. That experiment I showed you, they actually they had drones with these these particle sizers on them that they flew back and forth through the mist cloud that the cloud brightener was making to make sure that they were getting the right size particles. And in fact, the particles extended 5 kilometers, so much farther than they thought. When I first heard about cloud brightening, I heard it from a polar scientist who was really, really nervous about the whole methane situation in the Arctic. And he had done some calculations saying that basically you could keep the planet cooled with an armada of like 600 of these cloud brighteners. You could keep the planet at 1.5 degrees Celsius for in the order of $1.5 billion a year. And when I heard that, I was like, that's unbelievable. But he was, I looked into it, and it looks feasible. And then when the Australians restoration and adaptation program, this huge, like $100 million program, decided to look at everything you could do to protect the health of corals. Nothing was off the table, no stone unturned. They looked at, I think, like 100 different options, and cloud brightening kind of rose to the top as something they should do a demonstration project and see if it worked. And it did work, and then they have funded it 7-fold to continue working on it. And I think they're looking at it really seriously as a way to keep the reef cool. It's a really interesting idea because basically the salt goes up into the clouds, and then after 4 or 5 days, it just goes back down into the ocean. So you're not adding anything to the environment. And in terms of the indigenous people in Australia are also have tenure over the reef. They have that the way their marine protected area is set up. The people, the Torres Islander people, weigh in on anything that happens on the reef, and they were on that research cruise, and they were like, we're okay with this because we're not changing the environment, we're not doing anything, adding anything or taking anything away from the system. And so that was really interesting to me. All of it is really interesting to me. And I don't know, why more people aren't thinking about it. I think because it falls under the auspices of geoengineering, and geoengineering is very scary to think about. But we're also already geoengineering our planet, so.
Hi, so my question was on the bacteria, actually. So you said that the new strain of bacteria is only giving about 60%, but it's still withstanding those higher temperatures. So is there any research being done on how to, engineering a new strain of bacteria that would still give the same amount of sugars, but retain with the higher temperatures?
So it's algae, so I just want to be yeah, so it's an algae. Have I heard about anything like that? I have not heard of that right now. No. But I wouldn't be surprised if people aren't working on that. It just might mean they haven't published yet. But it's an interesting idea and a good question, for sure. And again, this is sort of an unfolding story. And then getting up to the scaling question, like if you did engineer an algae that could withstand higher temperatures and give 90% of its sugars, how do you disperse that around the world? So yeah, but it's a really interesting question. I suspect someone is working on it. But it's a great question.
Quick question. First, Izzy, if you ever, Julie's daughter, if you ever want to heckle your mom, just raise your hand. And we're good. I wanted to call on Stuart Coleman really quick, who wrote the famous book, Eddie Would Go, that many of you probably have read. Used to run the Surfrider Foundation and is now trying to protect us all from human feces.
Yes, we need that.
But give us a comment or a question.
That's quite an introduction. Thank you, Robert. So this is a really significant week, and your talk is just so on point because, what we're suffering from right now in this country is a major bout of scientific illiteracy because the science is so clear about climate change, and to have someone like you to be able to reach scientific audiences and the general public is so important. And there is a question embedded in this. So this week is very important because this is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, just this week. And that was the major difference in Kaneohe Bay because there were open outfalls of sewage going into that and the reefs were declining rapidly. So we know this works. And Hawaii has the highest number of cesspools in the country and per capita. And so this is something because even that Clean Water Act is under attack right now with the EPA. So can you talk about some of the science about, because this is something we can control, the wastewater outputs, and especially from cesspools and that nutrient pollution and nutrient loading, about that connection with the reefs. If you could talk about that. Mahalo.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned that the coral, they live in these deserts of the ocean. They live in the tropics. There's not a lot of nutrients in these parts of the world where the coral have evolved to live. They like a really nutrient-poor world. That's just, they're like cactuses in that way. They like to not have that much fertilizer around. And yet, everywhere that we humans live, we bring fertilizer with us in the form of our waste. And also our agriculture, where we fertilize the land and our golf courses, and then that runs off into the ocean. And there's there's good evidence, at least from the Caribbean, that when we started agriculturalizing and when we started building golf courses in the 60s, that's when coral started getting some really bad diseases. And their immune systems aren't built for it. Their relationship with the algae is not built for it. They like clean, nutrient-poor water. And so, yeah, it really is, and this is something we can control, like Manuel said as well. Like, what we do up here on land is the thing we can control. It's a lot easier for us to control that. And so the more we can do to keep those nutrients, dispose of them appropriately, the better. And you know, sewage is not, it's not cool to talk about, really. But it's, but it's so important. It's just really everything. And eventually the sewage will always get the coral. And they do bounce back when we clean the water up. Or at least they do so far, until it gets too hot.
So I had a question. My name is Amihan, and as a scientist, it's kind of frustrating to hear like how we have to shoulder the responsibility to kind of clean up what has happened. But also as a scientist, like we have to also recognize the importance of our history and how we've gotten here. And you kind of touched upon it where there's a global north and there's a global south. And so this has happened by design. And in the places that you have visited, what is the role that more corporations are doing to help this situation?
Yeah, it's a complicated problem, as you said, and you are right. There's been a lot of problematic decision-making in our past, and you're right, like here we are. We have to figure it out now. In terms of the businesses, it's interesting because in the past, I never saw any businesses interested in dealing in science until I went to that Reef Futures meeting in 2018, when the sponsors were like Tiffany Jewelry Company, Mars Candy Bar Company, Iberostar, which is a hotel chain. So it was like kind of mind-blowing to me that businesses were paying attention to this problem. And some of it, I think you have to be worried about greenwashing. You know, are these businesses greenwashing? But some of it is actually productive. And sometimes maybe you do need to take advantage of businesses who want to get involved and develop some demonstration projects at least. It's tricky, and I don't know if I have all the answers. I don't think I have the answer to your question. Except for that we are seeing a change where businesses are paying attention to this now, whereas I think even 5 or 10 years ago, they weren't. There's some really interesting roles around creative financing for coral reefs that have come up. I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about some really interesting ideas around using insurance to finance coral reef health, to have complicated financial tools called like debt swaps, where you finance down bad debt and then in exchange create marine protected areas, and then creating blue bonds. And then there's things like biodiversity credits, which are kind of like carbon credits, where you would get money to protect the biodiversity of your reef. So there are a lot, I feel like we're at the cusp of some of these ideas around businesses being more involved in protecting our environment, but it's definitely, we're just on the edge of that right now.
Okay, we just have a few minutes, so keep your questions to tweet length.
Okay, so tweet link. This is not a question. I just think we as an audience missed a beat when you gave a shout out to your daughter for her courage in letting you share her story, and I'd like us to take a moment to thank her for that.
Very nice, thank you. Roger, CEO and President Extraordinaire of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival, tell us some things cool that are coming up in the next week or so. I don't let go of the mic. That's not true. We discussed this.
Yes. We have a terrific event coming up about a week from now with Ellen Galinsky on the science of learning. We have a terrific event about 10 days from now with Noam Chomsky. And we have lots more. We have about 20 more events.
Thank you. I wanted to call on Mark Hickson, who was one of our keynote lecturers some time ago, with two questions. One, what's one thing about coral reefs in Hawaii that we haven't learned yet that we should know? And two, tell us about a talk that you're going to give like next week.
Gee, thanks. First, thank you so much, Julie, for your book, for your talk, and for spreading the word about coral reefs. So very important. One thing that hasn't been mentioned this evening is the role in coral restoration of ensuring that there are herbivores, that is fish that eat seaweeds, on our coral reefs. Because when coral dies, either a new coral is going to grow in that place or it's going to be dominated by seaweed, in which case coral can never grow there again. And this is a huge, huge issue, especially on this island, with the overfishing of uhu, parrotfish, and many of our surgeonfish, and nenue, the chubs. So I hope some of the policymakers and politicians are hearing that. Yeah, next week I'm giving a talk for the College of Natural Sciences entitled Saving Hawaii's Coral Reefs, Why Scientists Can't Do It Alone. And I don't have any information about how to do it, how to see it.
Well, you can. We'll find it. People, intrepid Google searchers can find it. Yes. Okay. Next question.
Hi, my name is Kara, and I work seasonally as a ranger for the National Park Service, most recently at Padre Island National Seashore and neighboring Corpus Christi, where we sold Spineless in our park bookstore, and I picked it up and was immediately drawn in. Love your writing, and I just want to ask what I think everyone's wondering, what's next?
Well, I have a book in with my agent right now. It is fiction. As my first try at fiction, and it is about a 16-year-old girl who solves climate change through cloud brightening, and then the world has to kind of like figure out what to do with that. So we'll see. It hasn't, hopefully she'll say like, yes, I know the publisher who will publish this book. We'll see. So thank you.
I wanted to zoom out for a moment and ask a question of a rare guest. We have both a legal rebel and a member of our Hawaii State Supreme Court. Hard combination.
Totally.
And the former head of our DLNR, who's been doing a lot of work kind of internationally in forward-thinking jurisprudence on protecting reefs and climate change generally. And I just want to know if you have a question or a comment.
Well, I'd love to ask a question, but first I want to thank you for standing up for our friends, the coral in Hawaii. Our coral scientists teach it's the most important animal in the ocean, and our coral experts that are from the Hawaiian culture note that it's, the first animal that's mentioned in the Hawaiian chant. It's the Genesis chant, the Kumulipu. But as a judge, and a judge that is interested in Hawaii, especially the idea of it having a resource future, we're facing what's considered by judges the most difficult issue on Earth, namely climate change. And Hawaii's on the front line because the coral's supposed to be gone, right, soon, maybe within the next 30 or 40 years when the Earth heats up to 1.5 degrees. So to have a champion like you is exciting, but I have to ask, and we have the head of the Institute for Marine Biology here too, which is great. It'd be nice to hear what she says, but you know, judges have to come up with solutions. So if cases are proven where climate is being imposed on a community in violation of the law, climate change that damages the future for future generations, there has to be a solution. You've alluded to cloud whitening as kind of a macro solution, but the ocean, you said 30% of carbon is absorbed by the ocean, is considered maybe the biggest nature-based solution. So how would you characterize what you'd consider to be a kind of macro solution that could potentially keep the Earth from heating up to this 1.5 degrees? If you agree that that's a limit that we should be thinking of in terms of protecting our coral heritage. So thank you again for your great work.
I do agree that we need to be, well, thank you for your work and for your advocacy, because we need judges who are looking at this issue seriously. And my character in my fiction book goes to court for what she does. and so the court has to decide, you know, is she guilty or not of saving the planet. So anyway, I think, you know, I actually think we should look at cloud brightening before we look at things like fertilizing the ocean. I think it has probably fewer side effects. I think fertilizing the ocean was tried a few times, and what we saw, fertilizing the ocean would increase photosynthesis by phytoplankton and draw down more carbon dioxide. I think what we saw when we tried it was community shifts, big changes in the community of phytoplankton that existed, and then that gets, you know, domino effect down the food chain in ways that are really hard for us to understand. So I think that fertilizing the ocean is not in the first tier of things I would try. I think you hear a lot about carbon capture and sequestration. It gets derided a lot by environmental groups. I worked with the carbon sequestration group in Texas, and it's very doable. And in fact, Texas has already, what carbon capture and sequestration is you take the carbon dioxide from a power plant, you compress it, and you put it back in the reservoirs where those hydrocarbons came from originally. And it's very doable. They've been doing it since the 70s in West Texas. This thing called enhanced oil recovery. They do this all the time. They know what they're doing. I think that we should keep the industrialized situation that we've already created in Texas. In Texas has basically created this problem. If Texas were a country, it'd be the 5th largest carbon emitter right after Germany. And so let us store that carbon, force us to store that carbon in Texas, where we have the reservoirs, we have the infrastructure, we have the people who know how to do this stuff. Let's keep it there. Don't mess with Hawaii. You guys have other things that you guys need to be dealing with.
Do you have a favorite type of coral?
Do I have a favorite type of coral? Oh my gosh, that's the first time I've been asked that question. Usually I'm asked, do I have a favorite type of jellyfish? I mean, do I have a favorite type of coral? I mean, so yeah, I guess. There's this kind of coral called Acropora, which some people in this audience I know already call like weedy coral. But they're so cool because they're like, this genus has 128 species. And like, you gotta, like, that is prolific. That is amazing. So these are kind of the branching corals that are, you can see them all over. And they created the idea of, well, whatever, of the apical polyp, the polyp at the end of the branch so that it like knew which direction it was going, which is like cool. So I guess I would say that whole genus is my favorite. So.
I think that's a good place to stop.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
We're going to do a book signing, so you can also tell Julie about your favorite species of coral.
Yeah, I want to know.
Out front. Thank you to Alex and Ree and Kaya and Cheyenne and Joey and all of the staff who are here who made this possible, and thanks to all our sponsors. Thanks to all of you for coming, and we'll keep talking to Julie during the book signing. And there's cookies and brownies free for you Just like algae living within you if you were polyps, but served by Sodexo instead.
Yeah.
So, for coming. Good.
Thank you guys.